So thank you for joining us for the MIS Quarterly Showcase for the Next Generation Information Systems Theory special issue. The idea behind these sessions is to give you an early glimpse or an early exposure, early access to the papers and the provocation commentaries that are in the forthcoming special issue on Next Generation Information Systems Theory. Today we have a particular subset of the authors, and the senior editors are all here as well. And again, at each of the following two sessions, there'll be a different set of papers and authors. So we encourage you, if you're able to do that, to participate and to attend those as well. And pardon me, and I'm Brian Butler, and I'll introduce the others as we go through. The impetus for the special issue really was tied to the observation that there's new technologies, new sources of data, new critical issues, new challenges. In the past 10 years, there's been a wide variety of interesting developments with regard to information technology, information systems, data, kind of in a wide variety of areas. This has led to lots of discussion in the information systems research community as to what is our response to this, what is our responsibility for this, what is our engagement with these new ideas, new technologies, new systems. And one answer, or one response has been the idea that IS needs new theory. And in a lot of ways, this was kind of the primary prompt that I think led Arun Rai to kind of ask first Andrew, and then Andrew recruited Susan, Scott, Sean Zhu, and myself to work on this special issue. And it was the idea that new phenomena would need new theory or new kinds of theories, new ways of thinking about it. And that we could go through the kind of normal processes and identify some theory papers. However, at the same time, as we were doing the work of the special issue, whether that was talking to people about what the special issue was about, working with the authors that had submitted abstracts or papers, workshopping the ideas, it became very clear that the idea that IS needed new theory was itself something that people wanted to talk about and had many different opinions about. Do we need new theory, or do we need new ways of theorizing? Do we need to revisit old theories? Do we need to look at new methods? Do we need to engage with different people? Or maybe we don't need theory at all. I mean, so there's a wide variety of responses to this that IS needs new theory did not capture. And so in response to that, both in the editorial and in a set of invited commentaries, we've really tried to make those discussions visible, active, and support those and advance those discussions as well. So when I referred earlier to the work of the special issue, and this is a large number of people, in April of 2018, we put together a call for abstracts and papers. That led to a deadline in November of 2018 for extended abstracts, which resulted in 170 extended abstracts being submitted in a wide variety of topics, many different interpretations of what theory was, many different interpretations of what new was, many different interpretations of what next generation was, and actually many different definitions of what information systems was. So we kind of had lots to work with there. Feedback was provided to the authors after that. And then spring of 2018, there were 60 full papers submitted. And again, associate editors, reviewers worked to do the kind of provide feedback for everyone that had submitted a paper. That led to a paper development workshop in late summer of 2019. We workshopped 11 papers at University of Maryland with the authors, both thinking about the particular papers, but also thinking about what the larger message of the special issue might be. Following year, among other things happening, we worked to invite the provocations and the editorial review, and I say final version submitted December 8, 2018. That should say 2020, recently. And that ultimately resulted in 5 research papers and 8 provocation papers, and leading to the special issue today, with the goal for the final publication of the special issue to be sometime later in the year in 2021. We're still trying to work out with when that might be. The most important thing is really the people. This is to recognize everyone that was involved in this. Andrew, myself, Susan, and Sean. I hope I speak for my fellow senior editors, but I would say that while it is an accident of alphabetization, the first senior editor is really the first senior editor. In many ways, this project wouldn't have come to fruition if it wasn't for Andrew. We have 28 paper and invited commentary authors, and you'll see them along with each of the papers. As always, a large number of associate editors and reviewers. And we want to make sure we thank everyone, because this doesn't happen without the work that they put in, both evaluating papers, but also improving them. The feedback that goes with this is one of the things that makes MIS Quarterly unique among many journals. And then special thanks to Arun Rai, and especially Jan DeGrosse, who continues even after retirement to help us get this through the process. So I think in many ways she's retiring in the same way that some of our colleagues have. And so we expect to see her around in lots of different ways. And we're thankful for that. And so to get on to the interesting stuff, the papers, we have, again, 5 papers. Specifically today, we have a next generation of research on IS use, a theoretical framework of delegation to and from agentic IS artifacts by Aaron Baird and Lukwebe Maraping at Georgia State. So Aaron, I'll hand it over to you. And we look forward to hearing about your paper.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Baby. Hello, baby. Oh, pardon me. One of the things I was supposed to mention, I apologize for this. We'll be using the question and answer capability in Zoom today. So as you listen to the talks, feel free to post questions in the Q&A. We may answer them during the talks or kind of in the following. There'll be a small amount of Q&A after each of the presentations. And then at the end of the session, we will draw from those questions and other questions that are added then for discussion at the end. So again, please use the Q&A if you have questions and comments.
All right, just as a double check, see my slides okay? Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.
So on behalf of Lukwebe and myself, I first want to say a big thank you to the special issue editors. The process, the approach, the feedback received was very much appreciated, as well as from the associate editors and reviewers. We also want to thank Arun Rai for his support of the special issue and his feedback. So we are going to present today on our theorizing around attempting to move IS use theory forward, and specifically around delegation to and from IS, or agentic, I should say, IS artifacts. So first, we thought we'd take just a minute and provide a couple of definitions and then move into the motivation. So our first thought is that IS artifacts are really changing a lot around us. And of course, we don't have to pitch that to this audience. But an important piece of this is that potentially, or at least we argue in the paper, that delegation has not been foregrounded in our theorizing up to this point. So when we say agentic IS artifact, we mean an IS artifact that has the ability to perceive and act. And the example we use in this definition is such as to take on specific rights for task execution and responsibilities for preferred outcomes. So while this has always been somewhat implied or part of IS artifacts in the past, we believe that today's IS artifacts can do this to a much greater extent, and that requires more theorizing. And we focus these efforts here on theorizing around delegation. So we define delegation as the transfer of rights and responsibilities for task execution or outcomes to another. So in other words, a human agent, as an example, passing or delegating on decision rights or responsibilities onto an agentic IS artifact, or even vice versa. Perhaps you have a classification algorithm or IS artifact that then passes back certain responsibilities to the human agents. So one of the things that we want to emphasize in this work is that that works in both directions. So our motivation really is around two things: the changing nature of IS artifacts and how much more advanced they are now, as well as what was mentioned before, that delegation has really been more implicit rather than explicit in the literature to date. So just briefly, our motivation around IS artifacts, there's a number of examples out there, but for example, predictive text in systems like Gmail, for example, that try to predict your next phrase or your next sentence. Someday is probably going to be your next paragraph or your next entire paper. And so we are delegating a lot of our writing and formulating decisions to these algorithms, to these agentic IS artifacts when we do that. Or my specialty is in health IT. So, for example, in the healthcare space, we have surgical robots, which we know exist, but one of these days they are likely to make decisions about pathology on the fly. So, for instance, is that mass, or what is the probability of that mass being cancerous or not? And if it's high enough, maybe just removing it on the fly. And there are all kinds of examples. Dequebe here in just a minute will highlight one on open source code reviews. But the main point for theorizing, beyond the motivation, we believe, is that the delegation process in particular, again, while assumed in the past, has not been explicitly theorized. And so one of our goals with this paper was to explicitly focus on delegation between the two agents, the human and the agentic IS artifact. Now, our theorizing approach was to develop a theoretical framework. And the theoretical framework in our mind provides the scaffolding, the framework to develop any number of additional models in the future. So on one hand, you could argue that a framework is maybe a little bit too general or imprecise. But on the other hand, the position that we take is that a framework really provides a lot of structure and motivation for development of models and research in the future. So our goal with our framework, which I'm going to bring up a simplified version here, is to do exactly that, is to provide the structure that could spawn a lot of different models in the future, rather than constraining or potentially constraining future researchers to only one type of model. So I'm just going to provide some of the highlights here, and then Dequebe will talk a little bit more in detail about application. But I'll note here first off that our focus is very specifically on the dyad between the human agent and the agentic IS artifact. So there you might be thinking, well, there's lots of other agents that could be included, like the designer of the artifact, or in the surgery example, the patient laying there on the table. And of course, that's certainly true. We think those are excellent opportunities for future research, but for parsimony and conciseness, and keep everything contained in the paper, we decided to bind it to this particular dyad. So for the human and agentic IS artifact boxes here, you see some characteristics, including endowments, preferences, and roles. And so these are our relatively general ways of summarizing some of the things that would be most salient to delegation when considering each of these agents. And we note that these are not necessarily comprehensive of every possibility out there. Again, we're trying to be as inclusive as possible, but allow for enough creativity going forward. So endowments in this case are the assets or capabilities that the agent has access to. Preferences would be how they make decisions, either with their own mental models or, in the artifact case, designed in decision models. And the roles that they're in, such as being a delegator, a proxy, or even switching back and forth during interactions. And we'll also note that even though we have the same categories listed here for each of the agents, we do not assume symmetry between the agents. So we definitely acknowledge that the reason you engage in delegation is typically that one party is probably better at something than you are, or at least it's perceived that way. So while the categories are the same, the actual instantiations are likely to be much different. So for instance, the endowments or capabilities of the human will most likely be different than that of the agentic IS artifact, and the nature of the task or outcome that brings them together is probably such that one has more skills or capabilities in one area than another. So Dequebe will talk maybe just a little bit more of that in a minute. I'll just briefly highlight the delegation mechanisms that we focused on in this work. And those three mechanisms are appraisal, distribution, and coordination. So just briefly, appraisal is the assessment of one agent of the other agent. So the assessment of the human of the agentic IS artifact, or vice versa. And this would include things like expectations, sentiment, confidence, maybe even compatibility and reliability. And we'll note that those things are likely to change over time. So the first time you delegate, you're likely to have a slightly different appraisal than, let's say, the 100th time you delegate to the same agent. So that has implications for our theorizing and our modeling going forward. And we'll also note that appraisal is conditional on observability. So as we all know, black box algorithms are, by their very nature, black box. So if you can't observe what's going on, then your appraisal will have to be assessed on the outcomes or some other attributes. And vice versa, the agentic IS artifact will also perhaps need to observe the human agent. So if it needs to delegate back certain classification tasks, for instance, is that human agent actually capable of performing those tasks to a high enough degree of reliability or accuracy? Our second mechanism listed there is distribution. And this briefly stated is the transfer of decision and maybe even informational or, excuse me, interventional rights and responsibilities. We think it would be really interesting to consider things like how the determination is made of how rights and responsibilities are distributed between the two agents. Perhaps that's through negotiation. Perhaps it's a take it or leave it. For instance, you pay a certain price for a certain service, and that's all the negotiating power you have, or the only choice that you have. And that also has implications for how contracts are either implied or explicit or perceived or enacted on. So, for example, an example we hear all the time is users' data being used in ways they didn't expect when they're engaging in activities with artifacts. And that would certainly be the case here. And then finally, coordination, certainly a classic information systems problem. It's also a classic agency problem between principals and agents. So we definitely wanted to include that here. But we'll also note that a lot of really interesting work has been done in the past 5, 10 years or so around things like accountability. So even if you delegate who is accountable for a certain responsibility or a certain right or a certain outcome, is there sufficient common understanding between the agents to engage in reliable delegation? And once you do delegate, are you eventually able to predict what the other agent is going to do, or at least understand what they're going to do to a degree where your confidence in that agent increases over time? So I'm going to set up Dequebe, and he's going to talk about the next section here. So that you may be thinking, so this is a framework that is useful, but how would I actually apply this in research? And I have to give a lot of credit to the senior editors and editors on the special issue for encouraging us to write a guidelines for application section. And I also have to give a big thank you to Dequebe for taking leadership in writing this particular section. So I'll turn it over to him, and thank you, Dequebe.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and thanks to everybody for the opportunity to share a little bit about this paper. So, as you heard Aaron mention before, one of the things that we wanted to do as part of this paper, and all thanks to the senior editors for suggesting this and for giving us the means for doing this, was to really speak to the scholarly community about how this framework might be applied. Not in a way that sort of straitjackets what scholars might do with this, but more so to kind of give them a loose set of guidelines about how they might go about thinking about utilizing this framework. Now, an important element of this, before I get into the specific guidelines themselves, is, as Aaron and I were kind of talking about or thinking about how we might think about this IS use domain differently, given some of the agentic properties of IS artifacts, is that we are really arguing with this delegation lens for a shift in focus to the dyad as the elemental entity or focus here. So not just looking or giving primacy to the human agent in the delegation relationship or to the agentic IS artifact, but really kind of thinking of it in a dyad, as a dyad. And in that regard, then this first set of guidelines really focuses on the task or the outcome of interest as being the occasion that brings these two parties together, these two agents together, right? So in a sense, this first guideline suggests that scholars should begin with trying to explicate or identify the salient attributes of the actual task that's being executed or the desired outcome that is to be achieved. And what that does is it sensitizes, hopefully is a good sensitizing device for scholars utilizing this framework to think about some of the key elements or attributes of the task. And that serves then as a stepping stone towards the second guideline, which is really about from a delegation standpoint, what are the main mechanisms that may be at play. And you think about sort of the mechanisms that Aaron outlined earlier with respect to appraisal, distribution, and coordination. So one can begin to think about which of these aspects may be more or less salient in essence, given the specific context that one is focusing on. From there, that really then steps into the third basic building block or guideline, which is really around thinking through what the core attributes, relevant core attributes might be on the part of the agents involved, both the human agent and the agentic IS artifact. And so we view these as the basic building blocks in terms of the guidelines. And from there, those in and of themselves, I think, give scholars a good bit of what they would need to progress in their study of the underlying phenomenon. And then we have a set of optional guidelines here. So we talk about, these things don't often happen in a vacuum, but they're happening in some sort of situation. And so there may be situational elements that may guide essentially which delegation mechanisms might sort of think about relative to the task. And then finally, thinking about potential feedback loops that may reinforce certain attributes of the agents involved, so certain elements of the tasks. And so one of the ways we've sort of thought about this, I won't go into detail given the time, interest of time, but we have this sort of open source environment where you have agentic IS artifacts that are essentially responsible for the assignment of tasks to developers. And so one could think about applying an example like this, or this framework to that delegation where the bots in essence are responsible for assigning work and coordinating work and appraising developers in terms of the capabilities they bring to perform code review work. And so we outlined this in the paper itself. So I'll leave it there and hand it off to Aaron to close us off.
All right, thank you very much. That was a great summary. And I'll just conclude, computer will let me here, by talking about some future research possibilities. So we think this framework is just a start. In fact, that's exactly what it was intended to be. And we really appreciate, again, the editors for helping us realize that vision. And so some ideas for the future are mostly around including additional agents, as well as, of course, expanding the specifics of the framework. So, for example, as mentioned before, there are certainly other important agents like the designer of the agentic IS artifact and like the recipient of whatever action is being taken, whichever action is occurring, the patient, the rider in a car, whoever is using that open source software that was managed by that code review bot. And we think those would be great places to look at further. Further, we think that agentic IS artifacts aren't just individual artifacts, but are really going to be an amalgamation of lots of different things. So if you take a self-driving car, it's not only the car itself, but it's the navigation agents, the monetization agents like advertising, many other things that can be considered. And finally, we think there are lots of questions around ethics that will certainly play a role that we did not delve into deeply in the paper, but we think definitely need to be considered going forward. So I'll thank again Dequebe as an excellent co-author, special issue editors, and everyone involved. And thank you for letting us present tonight. We appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Aaron, for the presentation. One of the challenges, of course, with a virtual presentation is that you're not able to hear applause. So you should imagine that now, because we have 280 people here. So I think it would be pretty loud if we could hear it. A quick question. Well, probably the question is quick. I'm sure the answer would not be. Is one of the questions was really kind of, let's see, considering your contribution, how does it impact current conceptualizations of IS use, such as effective use or enhanced use? And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what you see the connection between traditional IS use research and the ideas you're presenting, and how people might understand that connection.
Maybe I can start and let Dequebe take over from there. So I see a relatively, maybe a slightly controversial statement, but a relatively linear path with current IS use research from user to system to goal. And while there's maybe some influence there, there's not a lot considered. So maybe briefly stated, the key here would be, rather than that user using the system to achieve a goal as a tool, or even that system being more passive and just waiting, there's a lot more agency in IS artifacts where they anticipate, they're proactive, they do things that we would typically have done ourselves as human agents. So the very high level view is, that is key to theorize in the future.
So one other element I would add to this is I think you notice as part of the framework that we've tried very deliberately not to introduce the term uses either. And that's deliberate in the sense that, in taking a step back from this, we felt it was quite important to recognize that it's really this transfer of rights and responsibilities that is one of the core sort of foci of this particular framework. And in doing so, it doesn't necessarily give primacy inherently to one agent or the other in this relationship. And I think part of the challenge that we sort of faced or saw with the IS use, particularly in the term use, is in essence, there's an implied directionality, if you will, with the person essentially as the user of the artifact, which in some ways felt like it kind of precluded the possibility of the nature of that relationship unfolding in an opposite direction. And I think as we talk about it, I know it's an uncomfortable thing. I think, Brian, we talked about this when we were over in College Park, that this notion that, agentic IS artifacts can be in the business of, telling people what to do in a sense, can be an uncomfortable one, I think, for us as people, but we're trying to kind of use this as an opportunity to perhaps sort of break free of that discomfort and just sort of start with the possibility that it could be either agent and it can move in either direction, really. And so part of moving in that direction involves, I think, stepping away from some of this sort of use language and all that sort of comes with it.
Okay, thank you. And actually, the themes that you're kind of hitting at here is kind of the idea of some uncomfortable things that we might need to consider, assumptions we might need to consider, possible different ways of thinking about technology and systems. Certainly show up in other of the research papers and the provocation commentaries as well. And so you'll hear even some more of that today, pardon me. And then also, if you were to look at some of the other papers, I think that question of kind of what does it mean if our technology is telling us what to do as much as we're asking it, we're asking it and it's telling, wait a minute, I'm not sure that's the world we necessarily want. And how do we think about that? Again, it's certainly something that shows up, and there's some other folks that are thinking about that. I see several people have put questions, actually several, 12, and we will come back to that as well. It's also possible for the authors may want to answer some of your questions directly in the Q&A if they don't get distracted by the other presentations. But certainly, please keep putting questions in there, and we'll come to those as we have time. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. So in addition to research papers, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we noticed was that there were some of the submissions and in many of the conversations, people wanted to engage not just with the phenomena, but also with some questions about theorizing, where it comes from, where should it come from, what should we do with it, what should we expect of it, again, things along this line. And to really engage these kinds of questions, traditionally, these are the kinds of things that might be addressed in an editorial, and we felt that was limiting, to just have the perspectives or ideas from the 4 of the senior editors. So we invited 8 teams to write what we call provocations, and these are deliberately designed to potentially take a position and maybe create discussion around that position. So to start that, we've asked John King to begin with. The title of his provocation is "Who Needs Theory?" So John?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I am not going to use share screen. I'm just going to talk to you and kind of give this like a lecture without PowerPoint slides. So I got requested to write something on who needs theory. And I, rather than hold you in suspense, I'll tell you everybody does. But the reason that this was important to me was I had to stop and think hard about who does need theory. And as strange as it may sound, the first thing that came to mind was I had never in MISQ seen a paper on Nostradamus. And I started thinking about Nostradamus, who was a seer. And what is the nature of theorizing from a seer perspective? So I talk about Nostradamus and I talk about data science in the paper, but I am not going to talk about them in this talk. I want to go through and sort of give you a high level view of what the thought processes were that went into the paper, and then you can go ahead and read the paper. So I'm going to proceed accordingly. Now, the marketing people say that when you want to establish yourself, pick a brand and stay on brand. So I have a brand for this paper, and that brand is Chillax. That's a portmanteau of chill and relax. You put them together, you get Chillax. And there are two Chillaxes that go into this brand. The first one is between theory and practice. So I am not making a distinction between theoreticians and people who practice. I think it's all kind of the same thing. To illustrate this, I want to use a joke that was told to me by Kalle Luutinen a number of years ago. This was a joke that had a group of Soviet tractor buyers coming to Finland to buy some tractors. And they drove around in these tractors and they, used them to, plow and so forth, do other things that you would do with tractors. And they kept doing this. And the Finnish tractor makers got upset about this, and they asked the Soviet tractor buyers if they were having a problem with the tractors. Didn't they work in practice? And the response was, no, they work great in practice, but how do they work in theory? So I think theory can be kind of overblown, and I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between theory and practice. The second chillax is the relationship between theory and data. I want to relax the definitions of these terms just a little bit, and I think it's constructive to do so. So I think of theory as a form of insight. It may be a particular form of insight, a highest and best use of insight, but I think of theory primarily as insight and data primarily as observation. So I'm going to go forward with these two chillaxings. One is the distinction between theory and practice, and the other one is the distinction between theory and data. Now, my inspiration for this quite literally comes from a Miller Lite beer commercial that came out in the 1970s. And I saw this when it first came out on television because I'm a boomer and I was old enough to see this ad. And in the ad, which is on YouTube, by the way, if you want to look it up, is a fight, kind of an argument between two groups of were inevitably male celebrities arguing over whether light beer tastes great or light beer is less filling. And of course, the punchline is that it's both. It both tastes great and it's less filling. My argument, in essence, boils down to this. Research needs both insight and observation to go forward. You can't just use one or the other. Now, part of this ties back to an old thing. In the 17th century, the world's first scientific society was formed in Great Britain. This was the thing that became the Royal Society. And they published the first academic journal, Philosophical Transactions, which is still being published, by the way. And they had a motto. The motto was a Latin expression, nolus in verba, which means take nobody's word for it. And it went on from there. Knowledge under this model, and this is pretty much the model that we have inherited, is that knowledge is systematic mental schemes applied to facts. That is, mental schemes that make sense out of the facts, or as it's sometimes put, schemes that make sense out of the underlying facts, the things that show up. So systematic mental schemes, you can think of them as theories or insights or whatever. You can think of facts as observations, usually sense observations, perhaps modified or augmented by sensory apparatus like telescopes and microscopes and remote sensors and so forth. And we all, we know that it's all how you look at it, that there's a whole discussion that has emerged around that and definitions of terms and so forth. And that's led in the late 20th century to postmodernism. And you can fast forward from there to the concepts of alternative facts and fake news and so forth and so on. And we're not going to go there. We're going to concentrate on wanting to stay with the facts, the verifiable facts, and news that isn't fake. So this is a real cleavage in point of view, and I just want to acknowledge that the one alternative is out there, but we're not going to talk about that. So what we are going to talk about are the consequences of chillaxing, which is neither insight nor observation can stand alone. You need the two to kind of excite each other, rub each other, interact with each other. So at the present moment, there's an imbalance. And I think it's important to recognize what this imbalance is. On the one hand, you have observation that's getting kind of a pass on things. Observation shows up as big data or data science. Quite often, it's articulated in ways that are quite startling. For example, you can go in the DIKW, the Data Information Knowledge Wisdom Pyramid, straight from data to knowledge, or sometimes even straight from data to wisdom, bypassing everything in between. This is a notion that's kind of embedded in a lot of talk about data science. I don't think it's really true. You need insight in between. On the other hand, you have insight, which is in many cases used as a scourge. That is, we're rejecting your paper because it doesn't have theory. That's a very common, receipt. I have had it myself. I don't think that the highest and best use of academic work is in over-investing in data science or under-investing in insight. So, just to repeat, I don't think you can have effective research with either insight alone or observation alone. You need the two of them working together. And the kind of metaphor that I use for this is the French concept of the dance for two, the pas de deux. And what we have in a pas de deux is two parties coming together and augmenting each other. That's what we see going on with insight and observation. Now, as a practical matter, most of the time, you have the insight following the observation. Now, sometimes it turns out to be opposite, but a very common, what I would call academic conceit, is that the insights come first and then the changes that lead to changes in observation. Lawrence Joseph Henderson, an economist in the early part of the 20th century, said steam engines, science owes more to steam engines than steam engines owe to science. I think this is generally true. Sometimes the phenomenon gets us thinking, helps us develop insights. That's part of the reason that the information systems field is so interesting. We're constantly being barraged by observations. And these observations should lead us to insights. It is quite often said that science discovered, engineering applied. Actually, I think it's both. I think discovery and application kind of go hand in hand. Sometimes they rotate quite quickly. From a Boolean perspective, these things are anded, not ored. Okay, I want to wrap up here. People are clever. They figure out how to do what they need to do to develop insight. And if you have any doubt about that, look up the Nietzsche pin-pain story. That's an important story for getting through this. I could tell you to take my word for this, but that would be a violation of the Nullis in Verba instruction from the Royal Society. We don't want to just depend on people's views of these things, what people say about these things. We want to have some insights, we want to have some observations. I use two examples to get this across in the paper. One is the autonomous vehicles story. The other one is the missing toilet paper in the pandemic story. Both of these are useful. It's too early to tell on those. So just to wrap up, the takeaway is chillax. It makes things easier, but at the same time, it also can strengthen discipline. That's it.
Okay. Thank you, John. I mean, one of the things I would encourage folks to look at John's paper, if you want to understand the connection between Nostradamus and data science, you know, that's one of the things John talks about. This is certainly a time others can ask questions. One question that I think kind of bridges some of the questions that were being asked for Aaron and Lokebe, and what you were talking about, John, has to do with the role of, I'll say, precision in definition. And so I was wondering if you could say just a little bit about how you think that plays into either data or insight or into theory and the things you were talking about, because we often like to have long discussions about what does this term mean or that term mean. Do you see that as being part of the process you're talking about?
I think it can sometimes be very important in the process of making sense out of things. I often encourage students, doctoral students in particular, to go and look up the longest definitions they can find. They're usually in the Oxford English Dictionary for the English language. Sometimes they contain a large number of examples, quotations that people have used the term in. If you read all of the uses that the term has had, or at least all the uses that show up in the Oxford English Dictionary, you can sometimes see that this term has been used in lots of different ways. The different ways that it's used often entail different things, and they teach you a lot about the idea. And that's what we're really working with in the realm of ideas.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. And again, the paper is available on the website, and I put the URL in chat. One thing for people just mechanically to be aware of, all the provocation commentaries are in a single document, and that's how they'll be ultimately published in their shorter papers. And that also helps distinguish them from the peer-reviewed research papers. They're just as much work. They're a different kind of work, but they have different implications for careers and things like that. So that's how we're clarifying that. Okay. With that, I'd like to also kind of move on to, let's see, I can put this up here. Natalia Lavina of All IS Theory is Grounded Theory is the title. And this actually relates to a question that came up by Aaron and Lokebe's paper. Several people asked kind of, what was your process for coming up with this theory? Was it grounded theory? Did you use this? And so another aspect of this, this activity we call theorizing is, where does it come from? What stories do we tell about that? And how do we understand where theory comes from and how it comes about? So Natalia?
Thank you, Brian. I do have some slides, and I'm not going to be as philosophical as John has been. So, but some of the ideas are very similar, actually, I think. So, can you nod if you see my slides? Thank you. Okay, so we were asked to write provocations, so I took that seriously, and I am arguing in my short article that all information theory is grounded theory, whereas perhaps before you thought that only a handful of folks who go to grounded theory, special interest group, actually do grounded theory. So I'm just going to ask you, and I know we have lots of wonderful folks here, to think about where did the theory in your last paper come from? Just take a second and think, like, would you say it came from a priori theory? Something you read about in another article? Would you say it came from empirical observations? So just think of your last paper. And I know, like, for the paper that was just presented, the answer seems to be, as I would argue in general, is in our field that it's in between. And again, it's a little bit, John stole some of my thunder, but I think that if we look deeply into where we actually get the theory from, it's usually from both. But if we look at how we write up our theory, it's usually we say it either came from theory or from empirical observations. And part of my provocation piece is to argue that we should stop doing that and pretend that it came from one or the other. So what is grounded theory? I know people have different levels of familiarity with it, so I just want to give a little primer. Grounded theory was developed in 1967, or rather the book was published in 1967 by Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss. I don't have time to give you kind of full history. I do a little bit more in the paper, but basically it came out of this frustration that many researchers must have felt at least once in their lives, that we are sort of often often constrained by prior theories that somebody else has written and need to fit what we're doing into that. And in 1960s, there was this feeling that lots of great social theory was already written. And there was expectation of young social scientists, such as Barney Glaser at the time, that they would just be drawing on those theories or other theories that have been developed and applying them to do basically data collection and analysis. And when those hypotheses were not sort of supported and there was some insight from the empirical data analysis that didn't fit, there wasn't much you could do with this insight. That's what happened to Barney Glaser. He sort of had this insight that didn't fit his hypothesis, and he really wanted to write about it. And he said, that's it, I'm writing about it. And then he worked together with Anselm Strauss, who had more interpretive researcher background. But what the idea here is that for many, especially even at the time, contemporary phenomena, these grand theories didn't really tell full enough picture. And out of that frustration, Glaser and Strauss have developed a systematic approach to building theory from about contemporary phenomena from observations and other types of data by analyzing this data together with insights gained from extant theories. Now, this together part is important because it's often misconceived that grounded theory only comes from data, which is not at all the case, never been the case. There is another important misconception that it only applies to qualitative research. Even in the original formulation, it applied to qualitative and quantitative research. So that's basically what grounded theory is. So given this definition, I am going to argue sort of that all IS theory is, or in some sense should be, if it's not grounded theory. So first of all, IS theory is a theory of contemporary phenomena. That's what we do here. That's what differentiates us from others. So that means that sort of it's often the case that if we were to develop some novel insights, it would be around this contemporary phenomenon. To have an academic impact, our theory needs to speak not only to this phenomenon, but also to prior theory. And you can argue that, maybe we shouldn't be doing that, sort of theory for theory's sake. But the reality is, and I firmly believe that bringing in this external theory, and that's also what Glaser and Strauss wrote, also strengthens your insight into the phenomena. So IS theory, almost by definition, is the in-between kind of theory, at least the one published in academic outlets. And I guess people like in consulting do some of their own version of IS theory without going to prior theory, but I think they also draw on some frameworks usually. So good IS theory is systematic in recognizing just generalizable patterns, characterizing phenomena, and providing the insights that sort of builds on prior work and integrates with extant theories in our field or in other fields. So as argued, IS theory is actually a classic grounded theory. By classic, I mean it's a kind of theory that focuses on contemporary phenomena and focuses on core problems in this phenomena. Okay, so why haven't we heard of this term more, and what do we gain by labeling something that doesn't need a label? That's the next question. So I'm actually in my provocation piece used two what hypothetically deductively written up theories that had major impact on our field. I hope nobody would have an argument with the fact that technology acceptance model, but Fred Davis, and IT productivity theory by Lauren Hitt had influenced our field in significant ways. And fortunately for us, Fred Davis has written up the story of how he came up with technology acceptance model in a book chapter. He told me about this over a drink in Paris during ICS conference. And I was completely shocked to find out that the theory was initially developed as qualitative theory. He interviewed people. He had then his interview notes flew away as he landed in a helicopter, and then only like the core insights remained. But I'm not making it up. It's in this paper if you're interested, documented exactly as I said. But you would see, I don't have time to go into this, but Fred Davis shows how his actual work was driven by this real world phenomena frustrations that many technologies and new technology was not adopted as intended, was not adopted at all. He then went in to see what the problem is. He then came back, and he happened to know some young researchers doing theory of planned action, theory of planned behavior. He tied the insights, and then we have TAM. The unfortunate part is if you read the original technology acceptance model papers, there isn't any mention of the theory development process. And it looks like a traditional hypothetical deductive theory. And you know, there is moreover, turns out that he went on to do action research and provide actionable insights and even a new tool to the company he was working with, which actually quite showcase the impact of this theory. The second theory that I write about is economic theory based on Lauren Hitt's PhD thesis. And that theory is basically working to unravel together with our other papers the puzzle of why do we see IT everywhere except in productivity statistics. And Lauren and Eric Brynjolfsson worked hard through multiple papers in the same process. Here is a puzzle, let us collect some data, let us see how it answers the puzzle. Okay, new puzzle arises, let us bring some theory. And here I had to, I think the JMIS paper is the closest to describing the pieces. However, unfortunately, Lauren hasn't written exactly how he's done it. And so I had to have an email conversation with him where he gave me more details. But it's, if you read how he has done it, it's exactly grounded theory method. Now, what's the difference? Again, it's written as hypothetical deductive. We don't have the insights, that a lot of insights came from his consulting work, from reading Zubov's work, and this other pieces. So why does it matter? Why am I advocating for sort of accepting that and acknowledging that some of this work is done in this way? Well, the main reason is because I think these two people were quite lucky that they were able to be taught because of the multidisciplinary PhD programs they went into. They had this insight as to how people develop theory. I'm also lucky to have had some of this exposure to how some of the theories developed, but not all of us kind of have this exposure. And if we are reporting more about how we develop theory, perhaps more broadly, our field can delve into the same endeavors. So the key takeaways from my papers are the following. First of all, I believe that there is value in educating IS scholars about grounded theory. And I mean both quantitative, qualitative, design science. There are some wonderful papers on using GTM for design science nowadays. But the focus should be on general principles and not on this kind of coding schemes and minute detail. The idea of grounded theory is just going after big puzzles, intertwining theory and data, and digging until you kind of satisfied with an answer. And that sounds very generalizable, but it is much more systematized in this work. The other thing it gives you is because of it shows you how to focus on core puzzle or key concern. You are likely to come up with more insightful, more impactful theory. And it's important in this education to debunk the myth of having no a priori theory or having only stuff coming from data. Finally, I also am calling for our field to allow space and to encourage people to report their theory development process. I take it the special issue editors already applied this by asking the first paper authors to write this up. And you can argue, well, it will take forever, right? It's already, we are contained by space in our papers. I actually think we can do it and, you know, make our theory presentation more lively by telling people how we have developed it. So it doesn't have to be a lengthy separate section. In presenting theory, it actually could become much more interesting to read if we say how we came about doing it. And the final note, of course, with any call for action and proposal of framework, there is a danger of overdoing it. So I certainly don't want to advocate kind of coming up with a new guidelines and principles that everybody has to follow in their papers. And like, I've developed theory by following these steps. I think that's dangerous. But I do hope that we become more honest and share how we develop our theory. And I think it would improve theory development in our field. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, 1 second. Sure. Okay. Ken, I would encourage anyone who has questions, and also, by the way, you don't need to be limited to questions. If you have reactions, responses, counter arguments, anything you'd like to put, you feel free to put that in the Q&A. Those are also things that, again, the panelists can see those and respond to those. Natalia, one of the questions that I think would be interesting for people to hear a little bit about is, so there's the idea of documenting or describing how we construct our theory at the level and the level of systematicity that grounded theory has. There's the stories we sometimes tell when we don't accurately describe. You know, we cast our theory as if it's hypothesis driven. You kind of you're suggesting someplace in between, it sounds like. Do you have thought on if there was one or two things that, you know, people could include in their papers that would get a step toward the direction you're thinking of? Do you have thoughts on what that might be?
Yes. Well, I'm actually, to clarify, I'm not suggesting it ought to be in between. I'm arguing it's always in between. It's a strong argument. Okay. It's always in between. The question is how we report it, and we're currently constrained by our sort of genre expectations of writing. So if the question is how to fix it, I do think that at a minimum, we could put on the method section, like our description of how we developed the theory. Now, at the maximum, I would love to see us both submitting and accepting kind of like honest narratives. So again, I'm thinking of, let's say, the classic Fred Davis paper could start by saying, you know, there is this problem. I went in, I investigated in a real organization. I've collected qualitative data. Instead of showing coding scheme, say there's 2 key insights came from this data. I then brought in this extant theories from psychology. Actually, in my piece, and in his piece, he describes how he first went into IS literature to see if he can get a similar insight from IS literature, which he didn't, and only then he brought in psychology theory. So all that would help people understand what he has done and also what else one could try. Perhaps, actually, I make a stronger, because it's provocation, I argue that it might have taken us less time to get to the organizational sort of extensions of TAM that, say, Venki wrote like 10 years later, if we knew that the whole setting was, you know, the importance of organizational setting. So I don't know, it's kind of hard to say what didn't happen, but my point is, I think we would have been in a better place as a field if we had the fuller story for that and many other papers.
Okay, well, thank you. And actually, that's a wonderful transition to Dirk and Sandra's paper. Not quite what they mean, but before I do that, I'm going to take the opportunity to make a somewhat slightly sarcastic remark. I'm really looking forward to using the helicopter filter as the basis for figuring out the things to focus on in my next paper. And if you're not sure what that means, I would encourage you to look at the provocation. It's part of the history of TAM. So with that, thank you very much, Talia. And again, we've got the virtual applause.
Thank you, everybody.
It's approaching 280 people. With that, I will hand it off to Dirk Dvorka and Sandra Peter to talk about speculatively engaging futures for theses, pardon me. Okay, Dirk and Sandra.
Yes, let me just share a screen here. I'm assuming everyone can see that. I want to join all of the authors in thanking the senior editors and MISQ for making this possible. It's a great idea. And we wanted to echo John and would begin with an observation that the future gets away with a lot, making itself at home in our lives before we've had a chance to say, no, thank you. Sandra and I have been troubled by our understanding of the world and our expectations of the future, and we're challenged again and again and again by reality. Our IS theories did not predict Russian election meddling, that we did not see the vast spread of false information, misinformation, disinformation. We did not see the kinds of conspiracy theories or the new economic structures around surveillance or the algorithmic control of what people see and do. Despite our theories, we're caught unawares by the events and the patterns of the world. It seems like we are sleepwalking into futures no one planned and no one can account for. And the community in IS says, oh, what a surprise. Let's do an autopsy and account for it. But these are not mere surprises. Surprises are events that happen unexpectedly or take unanticipated shapes within an existing understanding of the world. And they're resolved within that understanding of the world. These, what we're seeing, what we're all seeing, are unprecedented restabilizations of technology, of society, individuals and work, economics, law, into configurations that affect all aspects of our lives. The unprecedented subverts our theorizations, and it calls us to engage in our futures. If we are accepting a responsibility for the scale and the scope of technocultural change, it becomes imperative to ask of our theorizations, what happened to our futures? We have an orientation as a field to the past, and this was quite evident at a conference in 2018 when a colleague stated, I'm waiting for things to go wrong with AI so we have data to do research with. Our current research apparatus, it renders these futures unspoken, uninhabited, and it reduces them to extensions of the past. This leaves us completely unable to see, let alone respond to the unprecedented events and patterns we're currently seeing. This realization that futures are always part of our theorization, implied but lurking just out of sight, provides us the requirement that we find ways to make futures visible, contestable, and negotiable. We assume that we know the challenges of contemporary information systems. We need modes of theorizing that prepare us to recognize new relationalities, new logics, new practices through which the world is navigated and realized for future people who are not us. The cultural consequences of technology place an enormous responsibility on our research to inform and protect and prepare society to coexist with the creations we're making. Our futures deserve reflection on what we do before we loose monsters on an unprepared world. We need, as Popper suggested, bold ideas, unjustified anticipations, and speculative thought as a means of understanding the world. To be clear, we are not discussing ways to better predict or create futures. We call for speculative engagement with futures as a way to theorize the present. We took inspiration from Mary Shelley, whose novel Frankenstein is well known to many people, which provides both monsters and a Promethean aspirations as an allegory for the unprecedented. The story of Frankenstein does not concern out of control science or out of control technology. It reveals how speculation unsettles the established categories and methods of understanding the world. It focuses attention on responsibilities of researchers to attend to the social implications of their own creations. To provoke this unsettling, we offer 4 theses to IS researchers to speculatively engage the futures we seek to explain, understand, and to create. The first thesis, the unprecedented restructures the world. Looking back at Mary Shelley's work, the early 1800s were an age of discovery in which a vast increase in geographic knowledge and new philosophies, scientifical practices, such as chemistry and biology and galvanism, subverted the prior apparatus through which the world was known. But in Victorian times, these sciences and technologies were easily discernible. It was readily apparent that electricity and the steam engine and the railroad system and newly created forms of work were going to change the future. It was just not clear how. By speculatively deploying a living being not made by God, something unnatural, something monstrous, Mary Shelley disclosed the perils and the hubris of an unprecedented shift that subsequently remade the rhythms of life. It altered professional identities. It replaced the means of knowledge production and recreated the landscape itself. But in contrast, our present culture is technocentric. The sheer ordinariness of technology renders these socio-technical reconfigurations unrecognizable. We are automatically interpreting them through the lenses of familiar categories, thereby rendering invisible precisely that which is unprecedented. We lack the language, the vocabulary, and the vision to describe these unprecedented configurations or articulate why they matter. Our current research orientation to the past obscures our ability to recognize and research implications for the future. The second thesis, research as a commitment to futures, is a call to commit ourselves to asking what kind of worlds we anticipate and expect our theories to explain. From this perspective, the future is a profoundly vital component of the present and is a principle of present action. Our dominant modes of theorization conceptualize the future as an extension or an extrapolation of a familiar present into a mostly as familiar future. But our ability to predict or to design or to create desired futures is inconsistent at best. In 1968, a group of leading science and technology experts were asked to look 50 years into the future. They accurately talked about what would happen in terms of technology, but outside the domain of technology, most of the machines that have been created had consequences wildly different from what those experts predicted in 1968. A commitment to futures to theorize for the becoming of the ethical, the political, the environmental, and social landscapes in which humans and more than human actors will exist. Our third thesis is that speculative engagement navigates epistemic distance. In Shelley's time, scientific apparatus was oriented to the visible, the present, the measurable, things which are epistemically close. In speculating the animation of a living being, Shelley navigated the distance between what was immediately visible and ideas that were beyond the research apparatus of the time to make comprehensible. What we need instead is to speculatively engage with futures in their own terms, through approaches such as digital geographies, artifacts from the future, thought experiments, which can navigate the epistemically difficult terrain that we encounter when we conceptualize futures. Speculative engagement can both overcome a lack of empirical observations, and can caution us against the certainty with which our research apparatus portrays the world in the future. Our fourth thesis is our responsibility to inquire with alternative possibilities. We draw one final lesson from Victor Frankenstein, who laments, "Had I a right for my own benefit to inflict this curse upon everlasting generations? I shuddered to think that the future ages might curse me as their pest, whose selfishness had not hesitated to buy my own peace at the price perhaps of the existence of the whole human race." We dissent from the optimistic visions of futures which dominate IS research. What is at stake are the conditions of living with technologies in all facets of the human condition. Other research communities have risen to this responsibility. The Biological and Toxic Weapons Conventions and the Chemical Weapons Conventions engaged with dual-use technologies despite uncertainty regarding all possible lethal combinations and contexts. The Assimilar Conference on Recombinant DNA developed guidelines, containment practices, and prohibitions. It's time for IS to take responsibility for the consequences of our own work. So focusing our research attention on technology as a manageable and predictor driver of futures shape what we know, what we believe is worth knowing, and what we do not know. The illusion of predictability and our misplaced desire to manage uncertainty obscures the very questions which would enable perception of the unprecedented. We ask again, what happened to our futures? We can experience and describe socio-technical worlds which may or may not occur, but IS research, like Shelley's Victor Frankenstein, has Promethean aspirations, presenting both needed benefits and real and even existential threats to humans and more than humans. The Academy should again find its role in the vanguard by critically engaging the unprecedented, grasping what is at stake, and providing a foundation for speculative engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very provocative paper.
Provocation.
Again, it's it's provocation. Yeah. And again, I would encourage everyone to look at this one. It's a really interesting use of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as a way of shaping a conversation and shaping a way of thinking about research that's probably different than what you've engaged in before. A question that I think is, and this is potentially for any of the panelists, there have been a variety of questions about kind of how do we have insight about the future? What's the relationship between contemporary phenomena and engaging futures? Those kinds of questions. And so I was wondering, Dirk or Sandra, if you could say a little bit about how you see the interaction between the things we do study now, that we can see now, and engaging those futures, and how those two things relate or might relate.
One of the reasons we were motivated to work on this provocation was to unsettle the apparatus, which is a very broad word for the way in which we look at research, not only in the kinds of instruments and tools and approaches, but what we publish and the kinds of risks that we as a set of journals and institutions are willing to take. Speculation, conjecture, hypotheses are all educated guesses. They are speculations, and they are speculations within a particular frame of reference. What we have noticed is none of the ways in which we assess the future, predictions or forecasting or scenarios or technological assessment, none of them step outside what we think could happen, to instead ask the questions of what's the world like with these technologies being ubiquitous and basically out of sight, and then critically assess, is that a world that we would even want to be part of? How do we ask these questions of management, of vendors, of ourselves, about how is our research implicated in driving the narratives and the visions such that these are the worlds we think are going to happen? Are there alternatives? So there's a relation, but it's not one that's captured in the kinds of techniques that we currently deploy. And we have many. We have over 50 different future studies techniques. This is a step sideways to look around the corner and say a different kind of what is this world like to inhabit, such that we can then say, those inhabitants, is this a reasonable thing for us to be doing now?
Mhm. And this actually, and again, by the way, at this point, we're kind of transitioning to general Q&A. So thank you very much, Dirk and Sandra, for your work. And so again, I would encourage everyone, if you have questions for any of the panelists or questions that you'd like kind of to be asked to the group, or even arguments or claims you'd like to make, please put those in the Q&A. Another question that was kind of a theme in some of the things going back to Aaron and Cleve's work, where there were some questions about kind of what are some examples of delegation, what are examples of dyadic use in the way you're talking about. And I guess the way I'd like to frame that to kind of build off what Dirk was saying is, Luquebe, you kind of alluded to this at the very end of your comments, this idea that there may be aspects of delegation or a future use or the dyad that make us uncomfortable. And I was wondering, either Aaron or Luquebe, do you have examples of things that might have a little bit of the flavor of what Dirk and Sandra were talking about with future scenarios that you think your theory or concepts would be really useful for engaging or thinking about? Do you have hypotheticals or things that kind of motivated what you were looking at that you think might fit this framing?
Well, this is a little bit of a fanciful future thing, but one of those New Yorker stories told a kind of a fanciful situation where in the future you have self-driving cars and a bunch of other, technology things out there that are actually free to use, but they're only free because they seek to manipulate the user in ways to monetize whatever they're doing. So in that case, the car might actually encourage the user to go to a certain store on that trip. They have enough time between then and wherever they're going to buy something that has been on their wish list for a while. The car will take you there, encourage you to buy it, and then take you to your destination free of charge. But of course, they're monetizing the trip. So, I mean, that's a little bit futuristic, perhaps, but I do think that there are, as we theorize, there are definitely, benefits to what's happening, but also a lot of unintended consequences. Maybe not quite that futuristic, but that we do need to consider.
Yeah, and again, I think just to make something a little bit clearer for everyone, I think part of what you're talking about there that's really interesting, and this comes from the work you did, is this idea of, in that context, what does it really mean to talk about use? Clearly the individual is using the car, but certainly the car is doing something. There is the car using the individual as well. Looking at that dyad becomes very important, because only looking at the side of the individual, you're missing very, very important things. So actually using that as an example, I'd look at John and say, John, do you have thoughts on what you think about that as a potential future and the idea of insight and speculation that Dirk was bringing up?
Well, I would just say that you don't have to look for the theory behind many of these things much beyond the theory of the firm. The theory of the firm says that profit-making firms are profit-maximizing organizations. And if they can find a way to monetize things, they will.
And so Dirk, you were going to say something? Go ahead.
I'd just like to respond, and I agree that is a quite dominant view of the current situation in the world. But in our provocation, we are suggesting it's not the only way that the world has functioned. And it's not even the whole world, it's just a good bit of the world. There are places that the firm dominance is not as strong. What if the firm didn't dominate? What would a world of that look like, and how would that then change the way we think about information systems now? If that was not the driver, if we could talk seriously about degrowth, what would that actually imply for people and more than humans of the future? Not as a reason to do it, but as a comparison and a recognition of the dominance of certain relationships that we take for granted, that it could be otherwise. And is that something we want to be researching? Is what would that look like? What would a carbon neutral set of firms look like in the world? We have no idea how to do it. But what would it even look like, and what would the implications for the future be if we theorized in that direction? So it's challenging some of the ways in which we think about the dominant perspectives at a high level, such as the theory of the firm.
Yeah, well, the only response I would make to that is, if we wanted to look at an alternative, we spent a lot of years in the 20th century with one called the Soviet Union. Now, that was not what you're suggesting. You're suggesting looking at other things, but we have looked at that one.
Mm-hmm. Another question again that has come up in a couple different questions that sort of relates to this, and I think it ties a little bit into some of the things Natalia was talking about as well, is the question of how do you think about, how do you engage with, how do you study hypothetical cases or situations? How do you empirically engage a future? And actually, Natalia, your story that you cite and describe about TAM is actually a good example in that in some ways. He's imagined they have a hoped for future. It's not on the scale that Dirk or John are necessarily talking about, but certainly the companies had a hoped for future with regard to the systems, and that's not what they were seeing. And so there was an interplay between that imagined outcome and what they were seeing and how that played into it. But do others have comments or thoughts on, again, kind of this, how do you, and this, by the way, was a challenge we ran into thinking about next generation theory. We realized that to a certain degree, we were asking people to theorize about things that had not yet come to fruition. And as Dirk noted, that was something that for some people, they really couldn't do. We had submissions where we looked at it and went, this is describing, IS phenomena that we've seen for 30 years in a different way, but it's things that aren't new. And so we had to think very hard about this. So again, do others have comments on this kind of thinking about the future and theorizing about the future and challenges and ways to go about doing that?
Well, I unmuted myself because I think I always think about that, like, I don't know if others have tried submitting something to Harvard Business Review. I've tried several times, and what I found was that I succeeded once just recently, but what I find is similar to Sloan Management Review, but to a lesser degree. They want you to be more provocative than I'm comfortable in being, because I'm very uncomfortable making claims that are not based on my understanding of the world. I guess I'm like grounded theorist throughout. And if one is to take Dirk's sort of call seriously, one has to sort of let go of the data to some degree, because we like, even as theorists, I feel like what keeps me grounded is data. And with all the nuances, of course, we are not really doing induction, we're doing extrapolation and using imagination, but it's still sort of some grounding. So I did end up writing a paper where I like had to take this leaps of faith and say, wait a second, I don't have data for that, but I'm going to speculate that's what they want me to do. Maybe it makes for more like fun papers, but like that's one thing we kind of have to let go of the data to say something.
And this actually was something I think we the senior editors learned in the course of asking people to write provocations. Is that it was very clear for all of the folks that were working with that, and actually I would say this is true for the research paper authors as well. When we were looking at that, how do you mobilize? How do you write those guidelines or suggestions for future work to help people do that? Even there, people face challenges. And I think it really was tied back to what Dirk was talking about, which is it's safer. It is the number of folks that they were really not comfortable getting beyond what we already had data about. And to do a provocation, to do a here's the direction for this research. That was the challenge that I think everyone involved in the special issue faced. And so thank you to Dirk and Sandra for really capturing that really well, kind of the large challenge that we face when we're dealing with theory. Because as John was alluding to, we want insight because nobody is happy with the data. We're not happy knowing the things that we've seen in the past. We want to know how things are going to play out in the future. We're not comfortable with Nostradamus's approach. What other approach do we use? Natalia has challenged us to be clearer about what that approach is. And Dirk and Sandra really point to the challenge as to why we need to think like that, and think like that at a bunch of scales. And again, back to Aaron and Urquebe's paper, they show us what it looks like. How do we create a framework that allows us to do prediction and understanding and examination, not just at the high level, but also at the specific, the things that IS has looked at for a long time. So with that, thank you to all the authors. I want to hand it over to Andrew to make some, make some final closing comments. Andrew?
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, everybody. I just wanted to make some very general comments at the end. Really, I guess our view as a senior editor team is that developing and debating theory is the intellectual life of a scholarly field. And there's nothing more important than that intellectual life, the vibrancy of it and the productivity of that intellectual life, as we see the dependence on ICT and digital technologies growing and growing all the time. So we have to do all that we can to nurture, support and celebrate that intellectual life. And that's really what we're trying to do in the special issue. We're trying to support our external stakeholders who depend on the ideas we come up with, supporting the scholars in our community, support the field itself, and going forward, support MIS Quarterly and the kind of theories that we'll hope to develop in the journal and help the field. That scholarly life, that intellectual life really depends on you, everybody, taking these ideas further. And we all know that feeling as an author. Once we've let the paper go, the papers will take a life of their own. And we hope these ideas, these debates will take their own life, will be taken further in productive ways and interesting ways that maybe the authors haven't thought about. And we'd love you to be creative and excited about the ideas as we are. It's been a real honor and a privilege for us to work together on this special issue. We're delighted to be able to run this session and to talk with members of the community. I wish I could do it in person. Our thanks to the authors. We've learned so much from you, and it was a real joy to work with you. Thanks to the SE team. Thank you for everyone who's attending. Thank you very much for Brian and his team at Maryland for putting this together so well. And one just last thing, it relates to the discussion that Brian was just moderating at the end there. Sometimes, there's a concern, particularly at what might be considered in quotes top journals, to be conservative about ideas. And MIS Quarterly is not conservative. We want to be coming up with groundbreaking ideas, push the field forward, and that requires you to push us too. So send us your best ideas, push us further, and we'll try to respond. So thank you, everybody.
Yep. Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Andrew.
And we have another session again that's in 2 days. The information, the times for that are available on the website. And again, last of all, we will be posting the video of this. It'll probably take us 2 or 3 days, but by a week or two out, we should have the videos of all of the sessions. So if you're not able to attend because of the time zone or because of other commitments, we'd encourage you to look at those. Thank you very much.